Hello and welcome to chapter 13. We are going to jump right into this chapter. It is going to be about homeostasis and hormone regulation of the body. So in Anatomy and Physiology 1, you really covered just the basis of endocrinology. What it was, what the organs were, and kind of left it at that. In Anatomy and Physiology 2, we're going to take a dive much deeper. The goal is to understand how negative feedback works, and in some respects, we'll talk about positive feedback as well. And we also are going to focus on how the different hormones of the body work with the nervous system or separate from the nervous system in some cases to regulate the body. The two main regulators of your body are the nervous system and the endocrine system. The nervous system does so on a minute-by-minute, second-by-second basis, where the endocrine system really keeps your body stable over a longer period of time. It's slower to start and slower to turn off, but it allows for this more average or medium homeostatic value that we strive for. But before we jump too far into that, I think it's going to be important to kind of talk about what hormones are. There's a little bit of chemistry that goes into this. I promise we're not going to balance equations. But there's just a little bit of chemistry we have to talk about. There are two main classifications of hormones. Steroid hormones, or hormones that are derived from fat, and non-steroid hormones. That's it, just two categories. The steroid or steroid-like hormones are derived essentially from cholesterol, and they're basically full of lipid. They might have other molecule attachments, but they're primarily lipid, which means they're made of carbons and hydrogens in different ratios. So the hormones that you'll need to be familiar with at the end of this lecture are the sex hormones, essentially, testosterone and all of the estrogens, as well as some steroid hormones that come from the adrenal gland. In the adrenal gland, you do get a little bit of sex hormone. This is especially important in women because they don't have testicles that release testosterone, but everybody, both men and women, both release cortisol and aldosterone, which we'll cover in detail. The non-steroid hormones are basically protein-based. Some of these proteins are going to be very short and basically just a few amino acids long. Some are going to be really long chains. They're much more complex. Some are going to be classified as what's called amines. Basically, they are derived from just one amino acid, tyrosine. And we see this, it's a cascade of conversions. It becomes L-DOPA, and then dopamine, and then norepinephrine, and then finally epinephrine. And then finally, there's glycoproteins. Glycoproteins are protein-based hormones, but essentially they have attachments of carbohydrate. So this is just a general overview of what all the hormones are. Some I already talked about, some you will hear about as we go through. This is a review slide. Use this in your study and quiz yourself at the end of the chapter. So here, this is a slide that comes directly from your textbook, but I took a moment and I let you know in this red what each one is. So you can kind of put a picture with the name, or a name with a face, as it would be. So steroid hormones are going to have rings of lipids. And amines are going to all be derived from tyrosine. So this is not exactly tyrosine, but it is a derivative of tyrosine. This is norepinephrine. Tyrosine is converted a couple different times before it becomes norepinephrine. And the difference between peptide hormones and protein hormones is literally just length. All of these little three-letter abbreviations, these are just shorthand way of writing the different amino acids. In your body, there are 20 possible amino acids. That's it. And they're abbreviated in some cases just with one letter, or in some cases with three letters, just depending on how you notate it. And in the glycoprotein here, you can see we have our protein backbone, and you know that it's a protein backbone attached to carbohydrates because of all the add-ons. So if it was just going to be a carbohydrates, it would be CH and O, but when there are proteins added on, then you start to see other attachments. We start to see double bonds, we start to see a different configuration, we see the OH group, that you would not see normally. Now, additionally speaking, you might also see a nitrogen base here as well. So now that we can kind of put the chemistry behind us, what do hormones actually do? We'll talk about very specific hormones as we go through the lecture, but let's just first start and talk about them on a really, really basic level. So on a basic level, hormones are going to change metabolism in your body. Really, that's it. They're going to turn things on or turn things off. It's as simple as that. Hormones are going to essentially deliver a message. It's not so much that they have like a message in a bottle, but the fact that the hormone is present and that it's going to bind to a specific receptor is the message itself. If a hormone binds to a receptor, something happens. There's a change that occurs. And as that change occurs, a message is sent to the cell to either maybe produce a new product or stop producing a product, or to change how it's gating in different substances that are allowed into and out of the cell. So upregulation and downregulation are two terms you're going to need to be familiar with. The reason this is important is because as a hormone is floating through your blood, which it does, it's going to bind to a receptor on the cell surface, like I already said. But what if there aren't any receptors? Well, the hormone can't bind. What if there are lots of receptors? Well, then lots of hormones can bind. So the terms upregulation and downregulation are important because it reflects the number of receptors that are available on a cell for a hormone to bind to. So if a hormone becomes present and binds to a receptor, it might actually stimulate the cell to put more receptors on the cell surface so even more hormone can bind. Or, as it's upregulating the number of receptors on the cell surface, it might upregulate receptors for a different hormone or a different substance to allow a different process to occur. On the flip side of this, you can downregulate number of receptors as well. You can have a hormone bind to a cell and act as a giant brake pedal. Say, stop, we're not doing this anymore. And number of receptors will go away. So here's an example of how steroid hormones work. Now, a big, caveat we need to say is that steroid hormones are made of fat. We already said this. But the reason it's really, really important is your cell membrane. I should have put a circle around this. Your cell membrane here is also made of phospholipids, lipid or fat being the key here. A steroid hormone, or thyroid hormones to some extent, because there's so much lipid presence, they have the ability to just kind of sneak through the plasma membrane. They don't need special receptors. The special receptors are really just present for the non-steroid hormones. So because the steroid hormone is made of fat and your plasma membrane is essentially made of fat, phospholipid fat, we allow this hormone to just kind of sneak through. It gets into the cytoplasm of the cell and then it goes to the nucleus. Well, the nuclear membrane is also made of phospholipids, or fat, so it could sneak through again. And then essentially what this type of hormone does is it's going to go bind to a receptor inside the nucleus, and then it's going to affect the DNA. Or in this case, we see it is actually stimulating an mRNA strand to be manufactured so a new protein can be made out in the cytoplasm. So remember, hormones turn things on or turn things off. In this case, this hormone snuck in through the plasma membrane, snuck in through the nuclear membrane, bound to a receptor, and then the whole complex went and acted on the DNA. And it stimulated the DNA to be transcribed into mRNA. The mRNA transcript then leaves the nucleus. It goes to a ribosome out in the cytoplasm, and a brand new product is made. So we just turn the cell on to start manufacturing new products. So steroid and thyroid hormones aren't very water soluble. What that means is they're not going to float freely in your bloodstream that well. Because remember, your bloodstream, a large component of it, close to 50% of it, is serum. Serum is mainly water. So that being said, sometimes they have carriers or chaperones or helpers that allow them to get through the cell. So to kind of review the last slide and this slide, this is a great sequence of steps here. So whatever gland is going to release the steroid hormone, so it could be your adrenal glands or your gonads, your sex glands, is going to release the steroid hormone. It's going to get to the distant site by the blood, but remember, it's not carried very well in the blood, so the hormone wants to kind of get out of the blood and get into your cells. The steroid hormone is then going to go to that cell, sneak through the plasma membrane, get into the nucleus, affect the DNA, and make new products. All right, non-steroid hormones are a little bit different. Non-steroid hormones, they are very water soluble. They can float around in your bloodstream forever. Well, I mean, not forever. They do break down after some time. But they can't sneak through the plasma membrane. They have to bind to that receptor that I spent a lot of time talking about. When the hormone itself binds to the receptor on the cell surface, that is called the first messenger. And these are important terms you will need to know. So once that hormone binds to the receptor, that first messenger on the cell surface, it kind of stops there. But that receptor on the cell surface then kind of picks up and says, all right, I'm going to signal a whole bunch of other chemicals within the cell, so on the inside of the cytoplasm, and that's considered a second messenger. The big second messenger that we see all over biology is called cyclic AMP, or longhand, it's cyclic adenosine monophosphate. CAMP, or cyclic AMP, you can call for short, and that's just fine. So basically what happens is you have an endocrine gland that's going to release a non-steroid hormone. This is going to be really any type of a gland that we talked about, that we did not talk about, like maybe your pancreas releasing insulin, for example. That is a non-steroid, non-thyroid hormone. Blood is going to carry the hormone through the body. The hormone is going to bind with the receptor on the target cell, and it's going to activate that first step before cyclic AMP. It's called a G protein. So the receptor is bound to a G protein, and then the G protein gets activated, and then the G protein is basically going to get cyclic AMP together. ATP, the energy currency of the cell, is converted to cyclic AMP with the help of the G protein. So then cyclic AMP is going to activate a series of enzymes called kinases. Kinases are workhorses. Kinases do things. So for example, kinases are builders, and the opposite of this, a phosphatase, is an unbuilder or a deconstructor. So kinases do stuff. And I say stuff on purpose because it could do a number of things depending on what type of kinase it is. Kinases are item specific. So then the protein kinases are going to activate and build and make things happen within the cell. So here is an example of how that all works. So again, your non-steroid hormone, that would be this little purple ball, it's going to bind to the receptor. And then remember, it just kind of stops. It doesn't go inside. It activates the G protein here. The G protein is going to take ATP and convert adenylate cyclase into cyclic AMP. Cyclic AMP is that second messenger that's going to go activate the protein kinases. Once your protein kinase is active, it's just going to start to do stuff in the cell. So how do we control all this? I feel like we've spent the first so many slides here, the first 10 slides, talking about how to turn things on. Well, your body has to be very, very tightly regulated. If your body's not tightly regulated, then things are going to start to go wrong. Anytime your body's outside of homeostasis, it's considered pathophysiology or the potential for disease. Hormone secretion is mainly controlled by a negative feedback mechanism. Basically, what that means is once the level of hormone in your body reaches a certain threshold, it feeds back to the gland in which it was secreted from and turns it off. So there's constant sensors on these glands looking for how much hormone is in the blood. Hormones have to be precisely regulated because a lot of these processes are very, very helpful until they run wild, and then they can make you very, very ill. Hormones, when they're being turned off, basically get chopped up into tiny little pieces, and they're going to get excreted through your liver or your kidneys on the way out of your body. Now, there's a couple instances of positive feedback. Positive feedback is very different than negative feedback. Positive feedback, there's not a traditional off switch. It just basically means one change leads to another, leads to another, leads to another to make whatever's happening in the cell get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. A good example of this would be childbirth. So ultimately, the off switch for childbirth is parturition, or having the baby. But all the changes that are happening in a woman's body as she's getting ready to undergo parturition or have a baby, they get amplified and bigger and bigger. If I have any moms listening in the audience, you probably can agree with that. So you start to experience muscle contractions in the uterus. And then they get more and more and more violent until essentially the baby is expelled. There are lots of other changes that are happening too, but the one thing you have to remember is there's not an essential off switch because of the hormones. It's just a feed forward only pathway. Having the baby is the off switch. But negative feedback is really important for most other hormones. So we'll talk about 3 different ways you can control turning off hormones. One of them, the first example, is tropic hormones. So basically what this means is that a hormone is going to act on something else. So the hormone comes from, let's say, the thyroid. And it is not going to act on the thyroid itself. It's going to go act on another site. The other way we can have control is via the nervous system. So in some cases, your neurons are going to fire a neurotransmitter directly onto glands, and then those glands will start to release the hormones. A good example of this is the connection between the hypothalamus in the brain and the pituitary. It's at the base of the brain, but the roof of the mouth, it's considered the master gland. We'll talk more about that later. Another way you can change or control hormone secretion is by changing the composition of the environment within your body. So basically, if there's changing of a level of something in your body, like maybe you don't have enough sodium or you have too much sodium, you can release a substance into your body that can make you excrete more sodium through your kidney or retain more sodium in your kidney, as whatever the case may need to be. And this is a great picture that kind of summarizes what we were talking about. So tropic hormones. So tropic hormones are going to come from glands themselves, whatever the endocrine gland is. But the one thing you need to know is that the endocrine glands of the body, that I have a picture and I will show you coming up, are all regulated by the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland releases factors that act on the endocrine gland to stimulate it into action. But the pituitary gland is controlled by the hypothalamus. So basically what happens is when the endocrine gland itself releases a substance, it's going to feed back, and the pituitary gland is going to say, whoa, there's enough thyroid hormone here. I don't need to be releasing the factor that stimulates the thyroid to make hormones. So on top of that, the thyroid hormone, as our example, can feed back to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus can shut it down just at a higher level. All right, so nervous system control basically is your brain and your spinal cord are just going to be in charge of the whole action. So you're going to get feedback directly to your nervous system, and it would turn on and off the glands and kind of bypass the need for the pituitary. And then we talk about changes in the environment. Again, this has everything to do with our example of sodium. If you have a lot of sodium, then you might turn off or turn on release of a hormone. And once the level of sodium is regulated back to homeostasis, then the action just kind of goes away. I love this slide. This is a great review of exactly how your body wants to live. I'm going to skip ahead one slide and then I'm going to come back to this. So don't get too lost on me. And what I mean by how your body wants to live, your body wants to live at an average. So average here is this straight line. You want to be at an average, medium, homeostatic level. And notice there's no specific numbers. And that's because the numbers don't matter. You just want an average. Every single hormone, every single substance, every single chemical in your body is going to have a just slightly different average. So that being said, I don't want to make one graph with numbers that you think you have to memorize. So the average is the average. You want to be at this level, but this curvy line is what you actually do. You're hardly ever actually at average. Based on your hormones, you go a little above, a little below, a little above, a little below, and so on and so forth. And you're constantly making changes in order to keep yourself at this average. So this above and this below average out to the medium level. What this means is you're never actually in perfect homeostasis, but in a constant state of flux. The constant state of flux is what gives you the appropriate average that you need to be healthy. So constantly being in change makes you constant, for lack of a better term. But that's really how our bodies work. Okay, so now I'm going to flip back. So again, think of this box here as that average that we just talked about. So let's look, we have 2 possible stimuli, 1 and 2 here. This is a stimulus where the hormone level is going to rise or control a process is going to increase. Here, you're going to have a stimulus and the hormone level is going to drop, or the control of the process is going to decrease. So let's talk about the rise first. So let's say we're releasing a hormone from a gland. We can use the thyroid hormone, for example. We have thyroid hormone levels are going to go up. So here we're going to have a response from the receptors. So we are going to have the hormone binding to receptors because there's lots and lots of hormone present. And now here we're going to have the control center is going to be at the gland. Now, as the hormone levels go up, we might not need that much hormone in the body anymore. So as they were going up, we were affecting a change. We were making things happen, increasing metabolic level. But then it gets to a certain point, and the thyroid gland and the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus are saying, whoa, we have a lot, we don't need any more. So now we go to what happens. What happens is we start to shut the endocrine gland down. So then the response is going to be less and less hormone, and that's going to bring us more towards our average level. But then remember, your endocrine system is slow to turn on and slow to turn off. So as it's turning off and it hits the average, your sensors say, wait a sec, we have to turn back on. But it doesn't notice that right away. What happens is the hormone levels essentially are going to drop too low. Oh no, we don't have enough thyroid hormone. What's going to happen? So we're going to sense that at the receptor level. Well, there's not enough thyroid hormone anymore. So now we better stimulate and produce more thyroid hormone. So now we're going to the effectors and we're going to start to see more and more production of thyroid hormone to bring us back to our normal level. And then lo and behold, we'll have a little too much thyroid hormone and we repeat the process again and again and again. And the average is maintained. That is how your hormones are regulated in your body. So let's start to get into the specific hormone glands. The pituitary gland is considered the master gland. It literally lies at the base of the brain, kind of at the roof of the mouth. If you could put your finger in your mouth, you don't have to do this, and right where your soft palate meets your hard palate and push straight up into your brain, you'd hit your pituitary gland. So the thing you have to know about the pituitary gland is that it is divided into a front and a back, an anterior and a posterior. The anterior lobe is called the adenohypophysis, and the posterior lobe is called the neurohypophysis. Now, the reason for this is we see the anterior lobe secreting many hormones, and the posterior lobe does secrete 2 hormones, but is in direct response to neural stimulation from the hypothalamus. All right, so here we go. This is your pituitary gland. So here would be, so this is the thalamus in your brain. You remember that from AMP1. This is your hypothalamic region, and this is your pituitary. So your anterior pituitary and your posterior pituitary. Your anterior pituitary is bigger than your posterior pituitary, and your anterior pituitary is what's going to drive the vast majority of all the hormones we're going to talk about. The posterior pituitary is going to release vasopressin and oxytocin, but that's about it. All right, so your anterior pituitary, this is a really kind of cool picture. Here is your anterior, here is your posterior. Notice the blood supply differences. You get hypothalamic hormones, so you're getting hormones that come from the hypothalamus, are going to be released and go directly to the anterior pituitary by very specific blood vessels. It's a closed system. They actually don't leave and go into your bloodstream first. It goes from point A to point B immediately. It's called a portal system. That means it doesn't have to circle your whole body first. All right, and then here, it's a little different, the posterior pituitary. In the posterior pituitary, you're going to get nerve impulses coming down neurons that are directly going to stimulate the posterior section. So we have adenohypophysis, that's very blood related, and neurohypophysis that is stimulated by nerve endings. So the hypothalamus is technically an endocrine gland, but it is in the brain. The hypothalamus does things other than control hormones. Hypothalamus, for example, also controls body temperature. So how the hypothalamus is going to control your endocrine system really happens via a 3-step pathway. So each hypothalamic releasing hormone. So what comes from the hypothalamus is not a traditional hormone. It is considered a releasing hormone. the hormones that come from the hypothalamus are going to act only on the pituitary, and they're going to do so in a positive forward effect way. They're going to turn the pituitary on. The pituitary hormone is going to release hormone number 2, and the pituitary gland is going to release a stimulating hormone. That stimulating hormone will act on whatever end effect gland it is, whether it's the pancreas or the ovaries or the testes or the adrenals, and so on and so forth. And then whatever that end effect gland is then going to go out to whatever body tissue it's supposed to act on and do. Now notice we have negative feedback here as well. We have whatever that final hormone is can feed back and turn off the pituitary and feed back and turn off the hypothalamus. You also have the stimulating hormones that are coming out of the pituitary, and they can feed back and turn off the hypothalamus. This is called redundant control. This is important to make sure that we keep all of our hormones in very tight check. So your anterior pituitary is going to release, remember how I said, stimulating hormones. We get releasing hormones from the hypothalamus and stimulating hormones from the pituitary. These are all important for you to know. Growth hormone comes from the pituitary. Prolactin comes from the pituitary. Then you have thyroid stimulating hormone. This is not thyroid hormone. This hormone stimulates the thyroid to produce thyroid hormone. Then you have your adrenocorticotropic hormone, or ACTH. This hormone goes and stimulates the adrenal glands to produce their respective hormones. And then you have follicle stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, LH, that come both from the pituitary, and they're going to act on the gonads, whether that's the ovaries or the testes. All right, so here is just kind of an overview of everything that's happening. I just talked to you about this level right here where my mouse is. These are all pituitary hormones. And all these pituitary hormones have a special end organ that they act on. So let's take just a little bit step back. We have hypothalamic hormones as well. So I mentioned that thyroid stimulating hormone will go and act on thyroid hormone to release T3 and T4. Those are different types of thyroid hormones. But how TSH gets stimulated from the pituitary is by a substance called TRH, thyrotropin releasing hormone. Notice that many of these names have releasing in their names, in their designations rather. So you know that they are releasing hormones that go and act on the pituitary. So here you have corticotropic releasing hormone that then stimulates adrenocorticotropic hormone that then will go stimulate the adrenal hormones. Now I do want to make one note here, somatostatin, it's in red because it's a brake. Somatostatin shuts things down. Somatostatin is the anti for growth hormone. It is a brake pedal or a turn off factor in your body. It turns the other things off besides just growth hormone, but we'll talk about those later. All right, so this is a review of everything we've just talked about, but it also gives you things in names rather in a little bit more specificity. Growth hormone does exactly what the name says. It stimulates cells to get bigger. Now, it will stimulate long bone growth before puberty, but once the epiphyseal plates close, then it's really just going to stimulate cell growthward outwards. This will make you a little bit bigger muscular or around the middle, but it won't cause long bone growth anymore once the epiphyses are closed. Prolactin is going to directly stimulate milk production in the breast tissue after parturition. Thyroid stimulating hormone will stimulate the thyroid to produce both T3 and T4, both active forms of thyroid hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone is going to stimulate the secretion of cortisol and aldosterone specifically, among a few others, from your adrenal gland. And then we have FSH and LH. Now, both of them are important in both males and females. So don't get stuck thinking that one is just for males and one is just for females. They do different things depending on the gender. So FSH is going to cause growth and development of ovarian follicles. So it's going to stimulate follicle growth and maturation. And it's actually going to stimulate sperm production in men. LH, it will cause ovulation. it actually physically triggers the rupture of the follicle so the egg can be released. LH is also really important in men for production of testosterone, but it's important in women too for production of estrogens. So here's an example. We're going to just use thyroid hormone as the example of how the negative feedback works. We've talked about it in theory, but now we're going to put it into real practice. So let's get a little bit familiar with the geography, if you will. So here's the hypothalamus. This is up in the brain. This is the pituitary. Remember, it's right at the base of the hypothalamus. It's right kind of at the roof of your mouth. So the reason I mention that is because the anterior pituitary, this is during fetal development, actually grows upwards from the roof of your mouth, and the posterior pituitary actually grows down from the brain, and they meet and they merge during development. So that's your fun fact of the day. So the hypothalamus is going to release thyrotropic releasing hormone. That is going to stimulate the anterior pituitary. We're only focusing on that right now to release thyroid stimulating hormone. This TSH is going to get into the blood. So notice here from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, there's no, let me go back, sorry about that. There's no major dump into the blood. It only goes through those portal veins from point A to point B. Now here, TSH goes in the blood and it can float all over your body, and then hopefully it will land on the thyroid gland. It then will stimulate production of thyroid hormone that can go out and act on cells of your body. Thyroid hormone upregulates your metabolism. Well, then if thyroid hormones become too abundant, there's too much in your body, it feeds back to sensors on the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus and says, whoa, there's too much. Let's go ahead and turn it off. So the posterior pituitary really only releases two hormones, antidiuretic hormone, or it's also called vasopressin, and oxytocin. So antidiuretic hormone basically takes your urine production and drives it down. So it basically reduces the amount of water that the kidneys are excreting. So this hormone would be released when you're dehydrated. So either you haven't consumed enough water or you're taking a long stroll through the Sahara Desert. I mean, either way, folks. But your kidneys are going to want to retain water. So as they retain the water, ADH will stimulate all of the channels, they're called aquaporins, that release water to your urine. It'll basically pull them out of the membrane and shut them down and hold them until you have enough water where you can release it again. Oxytocin is the other hormone that comes out of the posterior pituitary, and this stimulates contraction of the uterine wall. So this also upregulates those spasms in the uterus that lead to parturition or the propulsion or expulsion of the baby. Also, oxytocin is going to stimulate muscle contraction that's going to allow ejection of milk during lactation. So prolactin stimulates milk production, but oxytocin is going to stimulate ejection or release of the milk. All right, this is a review. I'm not going to talk about this again because I literally just covered all of this. This is a great study slide. Review this on your own. All right, so a little bit more on the thyroid hormone. So thyroid hormone is important because it is going to regulate your metabolism. There are three main hormones that can come out of the thyroid gland. You have thyroxine, which is T4, triiodothyronine, which is T3, and calcitonin. Now, here's what's interesting. You have your follicular cells, these cells here, are going to be releasing T3 and T4. They're going to be what's producing all of the hormone that affects your metabolism, and calcitonin is going to come from the colloid, and it's going to help regulate plasma calcium. So you have kind of a dual function here in your thyroid. All right, so here is another picture. Now, that last one you saw was a cartoon. This is actually thyroid gland taken from a patient, sliced, stained, and this is what it looks like under a microscope. So the secretory units that produce T3 and T4 are called follicles. And these follicular cells that I have highlighted here, I already mentioned, are what's going to be dumping out large amounts of T3 and T4. So you have your C cells, they're going to lay outside of the follicles, and these C cells are what's actually going to be producing all of that calcitonin. All right, so here are what the differences look like in T3 and T4. Please do not memorize these chemical structures. There's no need for that. But I just want to show you kind of what the differences are. So here they get their name, thyroxine. It's technically tetraiodothyronine, and T3 is triiodothyronine. And you can see the difference by counting the iodines. 1, 2, 3, 4 is T4. 1, 2, 3 is T3. So it's literally just on the difference of the number of iodines. So here's the catch. T3 is more potent of a thyroid hormone, but T4 is more abundant in the body. But they both essentially do the same thing. So calcitonin is that other hormone that comes from the C cells, and its job is to lower blood calcium. So if you have too much calcium in your blood, calcitonin takes it out, and it's going to stimulate deposition of the calcium into long-term storage in your bones. Or potentially, it could stimulate release of calcium into your urine via the kidneys. Your parathyroid glands are on the back side of your thyroid. So this is your trachea, this is your windpipe, this is your esophagus where the food travels, this is your thyroid. You're used to seeing your thyroid from the other side. Your thyroid literally wraps around your trachea and your esophagus, and then there's a big gap in the back. Now, embedded on the thyroid is the parathyroid. So there's 4 of them. You should have 4 of them. There are pathological conditions where you might have less, but most often people who have parathyroid pathology actually have more. But it's super, super uncommon. So they secrete one hormone called parathyroid hormone, or sometimes it's called parathormone. It's the same thing. Parathyroid hormone is going to regulate calcium and phosphate concentrations in the blood. The thing that you need to know is that calcitonin and parathyroid hormone work in direct opposition to one another. One is the pro, one is the con. They are the check and the balance for one another. So where calcitonin was going to take calcium out of your blood, parathyroid hormone is going to put calcium into your blood. Parathyroid hormone will also remove phosphate from the blood. Parathyroid hormone specifically is going to act on the bones, the kidneys, and the intestines. And this is important because as parathyroid hormone acts on your bones, it can actually stimulate bone breakdown so the bone releases calcium into the blood. So it can also affect your kidneys by allowing less excretion outwards and retaining the calcium in your blood. And then finally in your intestines, it can increase the ability to absorb calcium from the food that you're eating. One note that I want to make here, this is important, parathyroid hormone also acts on kidneys to affect vitamin D. Here's the catch. You could have all the calcium that you want in the whole world, eat all the dairy you could possibly eat, and it will do nothing in your body if you don't have active vitamin D. Active vitamin D is called calcitrol or dihydroxycholecalciferol, or you could just call it active vitamin D3. That is the same thing. So you have to have vitamin D on board or calcium will not have an effect. So for example, when people want to take multivitamins, I don't take a calcium supplement because I eat tons of dairy. However, I take a vitamin D supplement to make sure I have the vitamin D on board that I can utilize all of the calcium from my diet. All right, so again, going back to the negative feedback loop of how parathyroid hormone works. So for example, we'll start here with my yellow circle. Let's say you have a decreased blood calcium. So there are sensors on the parathyroid looking for the amount of blood calcium. As your amount of blood calcium goes down, parathyroid hormone is stimulated to be released. It dumps into your bloodstream and it can then act on any of the sources that we talked about. It can react on your bones, your kidneys, or your intestines. So based on where it acts, you're then going to get an increase in blood calcium in the blood. And then wait a sec, oh no, there's too much blood calcium now. What do? Well, it feeds back and simply turns off parathyroid hormone, Or on the flip side, it's now going to turn on calcitonin. All right, switching gears, moving a little bit further south in your body, we're going to talk about the adrenal glands. The adrenal glands are also called the suprarenal glands. They are located directly superior or above the kidneys. They are encased in perirenal fat. Your kidneys have a capsule of fat for protection that surrounds them, and your adrenal glands are within that capsule. They are not necessarily associated with the kidneys in function. They're only associated with the kidneys in location. The adrenal glands sit like a cap. Now, most textbooks will show them as kind of triangular or globular. In reality, they're a little rounder than what you'll see in the cartoon pictures, especially what you'll see on the next slide. But they do kind of have that triangular, globby overall effect. So there are hormones that are going to come from two main areas. The adrenal gland is separated into an outer cortex, and then the inner core is called the medulla. Now, you may have heard it called the medulla. That's fine. Medulla, it's literally potato, tomato, tomato. I call it medulla because that's how I learned it in graduate school, but it's the same thing. There are many different hormones that are going to come from the adrenal glands. Different categories of hormones come from the cortex versus the medulla. So we'll talk about a couple of those as we go on. So the adrenal cortex is going to make out the outer portion, and I have it noted here. So here's your cortex, here's the medulla. So here's the cortex, and here's the medulla. So the vast majority of the adrenal gland is cortex. This is cortex. And this darker brown is medulla. So the adrenal cortex is going to release hormones that are steroid-based. Remember, those are the lipid or the fat-based. And the medulla is going to release all amine-based hormones. This is where you're going to get your norepinephrine and epinephrine that ultimately come from. All right, so I think this is a really good review slide because it goes over what the amines are, what is going to come out of the medulla. So we'll talk about the cortex in a moment, but the medulla will hit first. So the one thing I want you guys to note, some people don't realize this. So as I mentioned, epinephrine and norepinephrine are what's released from the medulla of the adrenal gland. But epinephrine is the same thing as adrenaline. People say, oh, my adrenaline was pumping. Actually, it was your epinephrine that was pumping. Adrenaline's an older term. And norepinephrine is the same thing as noradrenaline. So there you go. It's a fun fact of the day. All right, here's the conversion factor. I mentioned that the amines are all derived from one amino acid. That one amino acid is tyrosine. Tyrosine is converted to DOPA by an enzyme called tyrosine hydroxylase. DOPA is then converted to dopamine by an enzyme called DOPA decarboxylase. Dopamine gets converted to norepinephrine, and norepinephrine gets converted to epinephrine. You don't necessarily need to memorize the full cascade. I just want you to know that it happens in a sequential set of events. So epinephrine and norepinephrine do different things depending on what the tissue bed is. So for example, in the heart, epinephrine is going to increase the heart rate, and it's going to increase the force of contraction. Norepinephrine will do the exact same thing. So you think, okay, they're pretty similar. But then we start to see differences. For example, blood vessels. Epinephrine is going to cause vasodilation, so cause all your blood vessels to get wide. But norepinephrine is going to cause vasoconstriction and tighten things down and prevent blood flow. So here's another one. Epinephrine is really important if somebody's having an anaphylactic reaction because they're going to need to give it an epi shot so we can dilate their airways so they can breathe again. Where norepinephrine is less effective. It will cause some dilation, but you really, really need to give a patient pure epinephrine. So this is a good slide to review all the effects of both epinephrine and norepinephrine that come from the adrenal medulla. Now the cortex is going to release 3 different main hormones. There's some other smaller ones, but these are the ones we focus on. Aldosterone, cortisol, and your adrenal androgens. We'll talk about those first. Your adrenal androgens are basically extra sex hormones. They are specifically testosterone, and testosterone that comes from the medulla is less important in men because their testes produce so much testosterone. However, men need a little bit of estrogen in their bodies, and women need a little bit of testosterone in their bodies. very, very small because usually these hormones are sex dependent, but you need just a little bit. So women rely on the adrenal androgens for their source of testosterone. This is maybe less apparent when a woman is in her childbearing years because of all the estrogen kind of quiets the effects of the testosterone. However, it's important for bone maintenance, and it's important for axial hair growth and even secondary sex characteristics. However, after a woman goes through menopause and her estrogen levels plummet, we start to see more of the testosterone-like effects start to creep out. So aldosterone and cortisol also come from the cortex, and they're very important. Aldosterone is going to regulate electrolytes, so specifically sodium and potassium. So it's going to make sure that your blood plasma levels have the appropriate amount of these minerals. And it's going to exert its effects at the level of the kidney, either allowing you to retain or excrete based on your need. Cortisol is going to be act a lot like an immunosuppressant. It's really fascinating. So we can take drugs to suppress our immune system that act a lot like cortisol. So cortisol is important for regulation many places in the body. It decreases protein synthesis, it increases fatty acid release, and here's the big one, it stimulates the creation of glucose from non-carbohydrate sources, specifically protein. So if you're fasting and you don't have any access to carbohydrates or you're on the keto diet, cortisol will stimulate the breakdown of protein into glucose so your bodies can still make ATP. All right, so again, looking at the adrenal gland, there are 3 different layers within the cortex. You have a capsule, which is like a protective layer at the top. Then you have the zona glomerulosa. It's a thin layer that is the most superficial. Then the middle layer is the zona fasciculata. And then you finally have the zona reticularis, which is the most interior or deep portion before you get to the medulla. The medulla has all chromaffin cells that are going to be releasing all of those norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones. The zona glomerulosa, this top thin layer here, this is going to release aldosterone. Aldosterone is classified as a mineralocorticoid. The zona fasciculata, this middle layer here, is going to be releasing cortisol or the glucocorticoids, and the zona reticularis is going to be releasing all those adrenal androgens. All right, so let's talk about the renin-angiotensin system. This is important because we're now going to bring in aldosterone that we just talked about from the adrenal gland. The renin-angiotensin system is a really important system to help regulate the constriction of blood vessels and ultimately your blood pressure. So the big end product of the renin-angiotensin system is something called angiotensin II. Angiotensin II is the most potent vasoconstrictor you can produce in your body, and this promotes massive blood pressure increases. You may think that that's bad, but sometimes you need a blood pressure increase, like for example, when you're exercising or during your fight or flight response. So angiotensin II is also going to stimulate the production of aldosterone. So aldosterone then is going to conserve sodium. What that means is it's going to act at your kidneys to keep sodium in your body and not release it into your urine. So the one thing you have to remember, and I'm going to say this once, I'll say it 1,000 times. Solvent follows solute. Wherever the solid particle goes, the water will follow. So in this case, salt is the solid particle or the solute, and water being the solvent follows. You retain sodium, you will retain water, and then you'll kind of appear bloated. But, and we only think about that maybe after a really salty meal, but ultimately the end effect is making a greater serum concentration, or I'm sorry, a greater serum volume, which will drive up your blood pressure. So cortisol is also regulated in kind of a 3-step process. You're going to get a stimulation from the hypothalamus to release the corticotropic releasing hormone onto the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is then going to release the adrenocorticotropic hormone, which dumps into your blood and it travels all over the body. Then it finally gets to the adrenal gland and it's going to stimulate all adrenal hormones. But here we're just going to mention cortisol, but it will stimulate all adrenal hormones. And you're going to have an upregulation of all of those into your bloodstream. And then you're going to see all of the body effects that come from cortisol or whatever adrenal hormone we're talking about. All right, so on to the pancreas. The pancreas is super fascinating. It's considered a compound organ because it has both endocrine and exocrine function. Exocrine function is purely digestive. There are cells in your pancreas called acinar cells, ACINAR. They are little clusters, round little, they almost look like little berries when they're stained on histology. And they release digestive enzymes like amylase and lipase that are dumped into your small intestine to help you digest and break down your food. The endocrine portion of the pancreas doesn't do any of that. The endocrine portion of your pancreas is going to release hormones like insulin, glucagon, and actually it will release some somatostatin. Another hormone we talked about before is coming back. So alpha cells within your pancreas are going to release glucagon, beta cells are going to release insulin, and delta cells are going to release somatostatin. So what does each do? Well, insulin is really important after a meal. After you eat, insulin levels increase in response to the amount of sugar or glucose in your blood, and insulin stimulates specialized receptors called GLUT transporters, GLUT transporters, to go into the cell surface to basically pull all of the glucose out of your blood and store it so your cells can make ATP for themselves. Glucagon is really important because glucagon is going to be released when you're fasting. If you don't have any glucose in your blood, you can't make any ATP, and essentially your body's going to shut down, and that's really dangerous. So glucagon is released to stimulate the breakdown of glycogen. Glycogen is how we store excessive glucose for long term. So glycogen is going to break down via a process called glycogenolysis, and it's also going to cause the breakdown of fats because you can also convert fat into glucose via a process called beta oxidation, and then your body can then make ATP. Somatostatin, again, it's the brake pedal. It just shuts everything down. When somatostatin gets released, both insulin and glucagon are going to be downregulated. So here's another feedback loop. I love these. These are the greatest to study from, so review these. So here we're talking about blood glucose. If your blood glucose level goes up, it stimulates the beta receptors. The beta receptors release insulin. Insulin is going to drive the glucose out of your bloodstream and back into the cells themselves. But wait a sec, oh no, we drove too much glucose out of the blood and put it into the cells. So now what do? Well, now the alpha cells sense the decrease. They're going to release glucagon, and glucagon is going to stimulate the breakdown of glycogen and fat to put more glucose back in the blood. And we keep looping back and forth, and we're never actually at that perfect average, but via the law of the up and the down averages, we end up at homeostasis. All right, so what does stress do? Stress is really important because stress is going to take us out of our homeostatic ranges, and that's dangerous. But we kind of depend on being able to go out of homeostasis just momentarily, but then we have to be able to put it back. So ultimately, we need to be at a homeostatic average or medium to stay alive. So when certain receptors are stimulated, so these would be your stress receptors, maybe all of a sudden you see a tiger that's chasing you down the block, or you're in a dark alley on a Friday night. I don't know. Could be any type of stressful stimuli or even some sort of chemical stress. Maybe you're incredibly stressed out from work and you're not sleeping. Maybe you're not eating and you're activating these stress receptors all over your body. So basically, they're going to send nerve impulses to the hypothalamus, whatever the stress receptor is. And there are different ones for different stresses. The hypothalamus is going to activate the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, sympathetic nervous system was, fight or flight, and your parasympathetics were rest and digest. Well, right now we're going to focus on fight or flight. So from there, you get your sympathetic system is activated, and the first stage of activation is called the alarm stage. The alarm stage is immediate. you get an increase in blood pressure, you get an increase in blood glucose, you get an increase in how you're breathing, you're going to get a dilation of your big blood vessels and your airways. So if you think about it, I've mentioned all of these effects are caused by different hormones. You could take each one of these effects and match it to a hormone I've already talked about today. Well then, if after the alarm stage, let's say the stress is continuous. Let's say it's not just a tiger chasing you and you got to safety. Maybe it's long-term life stress. Maybe it's psychological stress. Well, what happens then if you're feeling stress on an every single day basis? Well, you're going to have an increased cortisol level in your life. And it's going to spare glucose for the brain and deprive glucose the rest of your body. Glucagon and growth hormone are going to basically mobilize other energy sources for your other tissues. So it's going to start to break down your own muscles. You're going to kind of cannibalize your own muscles for protein because protein can be converted to glucose via gluconeogenesis. And growth hormone is going to stimulate protein breakdown as well as lipid breakdown. You're going to see an increase in the antidiuretic hormone, and you're going to see an increase in renin, and you're going to have massive amounts of water retention, so you have an increase in blood pressure over time. So remember, on a short-term basis, you want an increase in blood pressure so you can act and be able to do things very, very quickly. But over a long period, this can be very dangerous. All right, so this graph basically summarizes all of your responses to stress. This is going to be something that I strongly suggest that you review. All right, now general stress syndrome. This is something that I've kind of danced around, but this is that long-term adaptation to an increase in stress. So short-term responses to stress are healthy, but long-term responses to stress can affect your heart, can affect your kidneys, can affect your lungs. They can be damaging over time. So again, use the last slide and this slide as study tools as you are getting ready to take the quiz. All right, that wraps this chapter. Thanks for bearing with me. So if you guys have any comments, questions, or concerns, make sure you send them my way. Email me. I will get to you. I'll send you extra infographics or explanations or whatever it might be. Hormones are pretty complicated. The big take-home message that I want you to have is the negative feedback system. If you know the general basis of negative feedback, even if you don't know all the names of the hormones, you can kind of piece it together. Remember, we have the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and we have the effector gland itself. Most names of hormones have something to do with the gland that they came from or a similar theme, whether it's a stimulating hormone or a releasing hormone. Use your logic to piece your way through the exam questions as they come. All right, guys, let me know if you need anything. Have a great one.